Hi, everyone. It's great to be at the workshop. Thank you for the opportunity to present. As Tom mentioned, the title of my talk is long. It has deep learning generalization, extrapolation, over-parameterization, and decision boundaries. So we usually, in the title of talks and title of papers, we don't have all of these items. They don't usually appear together. But in this talk, I'm going to argue that in order to understand deep learning generalization, we have to consider all these other items as well. We have to think about extrapolation as the functional behavior. We have to connect that to over-parameterization, and decision boundaries are important because those are what function uses to partition its domain. As the outline of the talk, I'm going to start by deep learning as a mathematical function, and then I'm going to study the geometry of image datasets, and then I'm going to relate that geometry to extrapolation and interpolation as the functional task of deep networks. Then I'm going to present a homotopy algorithm for solving optimization problems about deep learning functions. I'm going to present a case study about cancer detection from genetic data. And if you have time, at the end, I'm going to present an auditing method to understand how deep networks work, to audit their behavior. First, I'm going to start with the geometry, but please feel free to interrupt me if there is any questions. I'd be very happy to go into details. At some point, I'm going to present some lemmas and conjectures. I would be very interested to discuss them in further detail if you have any thoughts or questions. The geometry of data would help us understand the functional task of deep networks, specifically in relation to interpolation and extrapolation. We have these models. I'm going to specifically focus on image classification models. So these models learn to classify images, contents of images. So this could be object recognition, for example, what's in this image, like what kind of an object you would see, like it's a ship or a truck or an airplane or a cat or anything else. This one of its main applications is self-driving cars. So you have cameras on the car, the cameras bring in the videos or the images, and there's one component of that whole system is being able to detect things in images. For example, detecting pedestrians or detecting other cars, detecting traffic signals, stop signs. So all of these, you can think of it as image classification because you have trained a model that has learned to classify all of these items in images. And once it sees them, it classifies them. And then through the pipeline, once you see, you have a pedestrian or you have a stop sign, there's other modules that would make the decisions, the appropriate decisions based on what has been detected in the image. This is also used for medical imaging. For example, radiology images, you could train models that could classify types of tumors in images, or whether the image has tumor or not tumor, or all sorts of these things. So we can think of these models as a function. It has some input, that's the image, and the output of the model is some class. And we have trained the model to be able to do a specific task. So because these are classification, the classification function partitions its domain, assigns a class to each partition. And the partitions are defined by the decision boundaries. So for deep learning functions, decision boundaries are geometrically complex, not just because the domain is high dimensional, but also because these decision boundaries have complex shapes. Let's focus now more on the domain. So the domain of these functions is a high dimensional hypercube. We can think of it like that because the pixel space is bounded, and we can always think of a pixel space as ranging between 0 and 1. And then we have these high dimensional hypercube. It could be a few thousand or even more. And then we have the training set, which is the bunch of images we have used to train the model. And we have that training set has a finite number of images in it. It could be 50,000, 100,000, or even more. These are like the actual numbers we have in standard image datasets. And then that training set occupies some portion of the hypercube. So we have some convex hull of the training set, and that sits somewhere in the hypercube. And that could be even smaller than what I'm showing in this picture. And I'm going to use this notation as the convex hull of training set. So we have this, and then we train the model, and that partitions the convex hull of training set based on the labels of the images. So maybe in this region we have like images of like cats, and in this region we have images of like airplanes and things like that. And so the model learns to, based on those labels of images, partitions this convex hull. But the entire domain is used by the model or the function. And these decision boundaries would extend outside the convex hull in the bounded domain. And there could be some other decision boundaries as well, some other partitions that are completely unrelated to the convex hull as well. That's also possible. So we have this notion of partitioning that hypercube and the convex hull. And the question would arise that should we care about how these partitioning extends outside the convex hull of the data to other regions of the domain? And the answer is yes. We have to care about that, and that actually provides a lot of insights about the deep learning models, because testing samples can be outside the convex hull of training set, still within that bounded hypercube that we have. So the first message of this portion of the talk on the geometry is that the functional task of a deep learning image classifier involves extrapolation to a moderate degree outside the convex hull of what it sees during training. So when we investigate these image datasets, we see that testing samples are all of them are outside the convex hull of training sets in the pixel space and in the feature space learned by deep networks. And also in the feature space, one could drive with wavelets or shearlet transformation of images. So whichever of these spaces you would be interested in, maybe pixel space, or maybe some feature space you have drive with wavelets, or maybe you are interested to, you have trained a model that works well, and you are interested to see what are the features it has extracted, and you go to the internal layers of the trained network and you see those features. And when you investigate that, you see that testing samples all fall outside the convex hull of training set. So here I'm going to present some empirical results on standard image datasets used in deep learning, just to show the extent of extrapolation. So this CFAR10 dataset is an object recognition dataset, and this MNIST dataset is a handwritten digit dataset. And we see that like this is the distribution of distance to the convex hull of training set for all those testing samples. And we see that all of them are outside, the distance is considerable, although the distance is not, it's limited as well, so it goes to a certain degree. This is, I think, the largest here is 27% of the diameter of the convex hull. So we go outside the convex hull, but we don't go too far outside as well. And then this is the distribution of distances in the internal layer of a network. So this is a standard ResNet model, which has 50 internal layers, and it processes the images. In its last layer, it only has 64 dimensions. And those are the features that are just in the next step of the model computation. The model's computation, it turns into classes. And we see that the distance to the convex hull of training set is still significant in that low dimensional feature space that the model has learned. And we see that these are the images that are farthest from the convex hull. And we see that these are the images that don't have any similar images in the training set. So this is an image of a dog that is has some certain features that we haven't seen before, or these are all images that we don't have similar examples in the training set. Okay, so how do we measure the distance, or how do we find the vector that brings a testing sample to a convex hull? That's a simple kind of a convex optimization problem. Since it's convex, we can solve it, and we can be sure that we have found the correct solution, the optimal solution. It's not so easy and fast to solve this because the matrix dimensions are quite huge. It could be, so this D could have like 100,000 rows, and it could have at least a few thousand columns, and like dealing with this is not so fast. We have some sketching method that solves it relatively fast. So if you were interested to solve this problem, I'd be happy to discuss that sketching algorithm. But once we solve that, and once we find its optimal solution, we see that the direction to the convex hull is important, and it contains important information about the image, the features in the image. So when we see, for example, for the plane, we see that these are the changes that have to happen in the image in order to reach the surface of the convex hull. And we see that those are related directly to the object of interest. Same with the sheep and the cat and other images that we investigate. So one of the responses early on in this project, one of the responses I was receiving is that the distance to the convex hull is not too far, and it could be neglected, and it doesn't contain so much information, it's negligible. Or some thought it could be considered as random noise. But once we see that those directions, we see that it's not random noise, and it's important, it's related to the image, and it changes the image significantly. So when we have this is just maybe some shadow of the ship, but it's not even possible for us to say this is a ship for sure. Maybe for the plane, but all I'm saying is that the directions to the convex hull are significant and not negligible. And again, this is for handwritten digits. This is what it takes to take this image of 6 to the convex hull of training set. This is what it takes to bring it to the convex hull of each class, like class of zeros or class of ones. And we see all these changes are meaningful. And when we arrive at the surface of the convex hull, that's also meaningful too. So this is when we have projected this to the convex hull of ones, and on the surface, this is how it looks like. Once we are at the surface of the convex hull, that's a convex combination of a bunch of images. And of course, in these high dimensional spaces, we could expect a lot of images to contribute. But what we see is that the images that contribute significantly, that actually make up this image that we see, those are very limited. Those are not very large. Like maybe there are like 30 or 50 images at the most. All other coefficients go to like 10 to the minus 6 or very small, and they don't actually contribute much. And those images, you can see, like this is an image of a ship, but you can see it's also include an image of a plane or an image of a truck, and cars and all other things. So it's not like all of them are like ship images. So now that we established that this involves extrapolation, let me clarify what we mean by extrapolation. Because once we step out of the convex hull of training set, we could see many different things. For example, if we have these handwritten digits, once we step outside the convex hull of training set, we could also see these radiology images. If they have the same dimension. So these are all outside. These could also fit inside that hypercube, but they're all outside the convex hull of training set. And the question is that, should I expect my model that's trained on these handwritten digits to be like classify whether these chest x-rays people have COVID or not? And the answer is no. We have to use the term extrapolation in a very specific sense. And we have to tie it to the scope that is defined by the training set. So we don't want to train some model and say anything outside the convex hull we want to extrapolate. Of course, the definition of extrapolation technically implies that, but we have to narrow down the definition of extrapolation here to what's to the scope defined by the training set. So if we have trained our model on this falls outside of that scope. And if we have trained our model on handwritten digits, chest X-rays would be outside that scope. So this narrow and specific definition of extrapolation is actually studied quite a bit in literature in cognitive science, psychology, and neuroscience. We also have this specific definition of extrapolation in mathematics, of course. And also in that literature on cognitive science and psychology, we see that extrapolation and learning can go together. They're studied frequently together. So this is the collaboration I have done with one of my colleagues at Yale, Jessica Malik, who is works on these topics of cognitive science and psychology. So I'm going to in a very basic example of extrapolation is that we see in numerical analysis books is extrapolation for stock market. So you have the value of a stock market over a period of time, and you want to build a model so that it can predict the value of a stock market for tomorrow or next week or maybe next month. And maybe next month is much more interesting if you can build a model that can predict that accurately or close enough. And this appears in numerical analysis books. And it's also in practice, we know that people have been using mathematics to do these kinds of extrapolation in very specific sense that we want to extrapolate to predict the value of a stock market. The dimension of extrapolation is time, and the scope of extrapolation is the value of the stock market. Other examples, there are so many of them in cognitive science and psychology. I'm just going to give you a couple of 3-4 examples. One of them is about extrapolation that our brains automatically do to predict the location of moving objects. For example, you might have you might be looking at some tennis ball that's moving along, and then your brain extrapolates where the location of the ball should be even before you see it. So your eyes move as the ball is moving as well. And even if the ball goes behind some wall, your eyes would still continue to move, and you would expect the ball to appear on the other side of the ball at some location. And cognitive scientists look at the location of the ball, your eyes, to see how your brain is actually extrapolating and how it expects the ball to be. Another example of extrapolation is just much more tangible, continuous functions. So people want to build mathematical models that could emulate the prediction, the extrapolation that humans do, and they consider different types of functions. We have some x and we have some y, and they partition the x into 3 segments, like left, middle, right. They generate a bunch of samples, x and y's in the middle portion, and they give it to the human. And then they give some examples on the right and left, and they ask them to predict the value of the y. And based on what they have seen, humans tend to they extrapolate. If they see a linear trend, they would basically try to extrapolate linearly, but also exponential and quadratic, they do the same. As the longer when it's nonlinear, the farther you go outside the convex hull of what they have seen, chances are they would make wrong predictions. So there are all these models that they try to focus, and this specific paper is trying to build a Gaussian process that is good both in emulating human interpolation and also extrapolation. And then for graphs, imagine you're given these 3 graphs, and then you're asked to extrapolate on this direction. So you would come up with this, and this other direction, you would come up with this graph. And then, so these are all studies. And then also, extrapolation is studied in relation to categorization and classification, which is the subject of my talk. And imagine you're given two sets of points like circles and the crosses, and then this is the convex hull of sort of convex hull of the data you have, and you want to separate them, so you would come up with these lines here and here, but then the domain is bounded, but it's much larger than the convex hull. And the question is, these testing samples that we receive, how would we, a human or a model, would classify them? And here, the ground truth is simple. So the domain is partitioned into 3 segments. Middle part is category A. The side parts are category B. Okay. And then not just humans extrapolate, but also animals extrapolate. So this is another paper which connects mice extrapolation of geometric information. So basically says mice extrapolate the geometric information relative to the boundaries of a maze and use it to navigate also in the presence of a prominent queue behind the target. So when they put mice in in a maze, and then they investigate their behavior and they come up with this conclusion, and it's not just this paper, it has there are many papers that they come up with this notion that the mice actually extrapolate geometric information while it's navigating in the maze. So now that we first established that we have to extrapolate outside the convex hull, and then we tied it, we said that extrapolation and learning can go together, and we define the extrapolation in a very specific sense that is defined by the scope of the training set. But once we adopt this notion, we can answer many research questions that are open about deep learning. I'm going to touch on 2 of them quickly, and then I'm going to get much in depth about over-parameterization. So the first item is that there are some learning tasks in the literature that deep learning doesn't have a clear advantage. One of them is the FICO dataset. This was a subject of a challenge a few years back, 2018, at NeurIPS conference, that many people participated, and the dataset has been used since then as well. But overall, we have seen that deep learning doesn't have a clear advantage. But there are other image classification tasks that deep learning outperform every single other alternative model. And then for those, but when we investigate the geometry of these, we see that for those tasks that the deep learning models don't have a clear advantage, there is not a lot of extrapolation happening. So we don't need that extrapolation functionality. So for FICO dataset, we see that about half of the testing samples are actually inside the convex hull of training set. And for those that are outside, they're not too far outside. So overall, we have 1.5% extrapolation compared to the diameter of the convex hull. But for the CIFAR-10 dataset, we see that, as I mentioned earlier, all of the testing samples are outside, and their distance is significant as well. And overall, we have 10% extrapolation on average compared to the diameter of the convex hull. So this extrapolation extent can explain why those models, at least we see correlation between those. Another research question in deep learning, another open one, which has quite a large literature, is about out-of-distribution detection. And it's related to one of the shortcomings of deep learning models. So imagine you have trained a model that has learned to classify objects. For example, planes, trucks, cars, things like that. And then you give a radiology images of a liver, and you give it to the model, and the model could say with 100% confidence that this is a truck. And it wouldn't realize that this is not similar to anything I have seen before during the training. So this is one of the shortcomings of deep learning models. But when we investigate the convex hulls, we see that there are a lot of separations there that one could leverage in order for out-of-distribution detection, not just in the pixel space, but better when you process the images with wavelets and come up with a lower dimensional feature space, you can do these separations, and you can say, this radiology image of liver is too far outside the convex hull. Perhaps I should abstain. Perhaps I shouldn't classify it. So this is another application. But I'm going to focus a lot on the over-parameterization. So these deep learning models, they have a lot of parameters, and this is one of the open research questions about deep learning. Why do we need models with so many parameters? And why do these models have to have this massive functional capacity when we have just a very small number of training samples? And like classical learning theory, like is more invested in the convex hull of data, and partitioning that convex hull doesn't require that massive functional capacity. So here is what I'm getting at, is that I propose, I suggest that because of extrapolation, we need the models to be over-parameterized. That's a necessary condition. So the over-parameterization can be explained by the necessity that we have to extrapolate. So the way we train these models is that we have some training set, and we have a model, an over-parameterized model, and we have some loss function that whenever it's classifying some image wrong by mistake, it incurs some loss. And we minimize that loss during the training process to near zero. And that's relatively easy to do. But because these models are over-parameterized, there are infinite number of global minimizers. So you can achieve zero training loss in many different ways. And most of those minimizers generalize poorly. Only a very small subset of those minimizers would lead to a model that can actually generalize and classify unseen images. And there is not a good explanation as to why these minimizers generalize well, why those minimizers generalize bad. People have looked at different norms, different properties of these solutions, and at the end, there's not a clear separation why this generalizes well and that generalizes bad. And there's not an independent way. Once you have minimized the training loss to near zero, there's not an independent way to say this is a good one, unless you get the model and you get to test it on some unseen images. And if it's classifying them correctly, you would say this is generalizing well. And if it's classifying them wrongly, like incorrectly, you would say this is not generalizing well. But just looking at the minimizer, you can't say this is a good or a bad one. So here I'm going to offer an answer, and that's that over-parameterization is a necessary condition, but not sufficient to have control over the extensions of decision boundaries outside the convex hull of training data. So I'm going to get more specific, get to some definitions. So the first definition is that two continuous functions f and g are epsilon equal within a bounded region if we have this property here. So they're not there all over the domain for any x. Their difference is bounded by some epsilon. And this connects, this is basically very similar to the Weierstrass Approximation Theorem. That one says that any function you have within a closed bounded interval, you can approximate it with a polynomial such that their difference is bounded by some epsilon. So I'm using this definition. I'm going to use this epsilon equal term with this definition all along in the next few slides. So let's consider some bounded domain like this, and let's assume that we are given two sets of points, red and blue, and we want to separate them. And we separate them using this polynomial. It's degree 7, it perfectly fits them, so because there's no overlap between the points. And so we have this polynomial and this separation in the convex hull. So that's good. But then the question is, how does this extend outside the convex hull? How does this look like? So so the first lemma, this can be considered a lemma in 2 dimensions, but it's a conjecture in the higher dimensions. So if you have any comments, I'd be happy to hear it. So let f be a polynomial of degree n defined in a hypercube domain. F partitions the domain perfectly separating 2 sets of points x and y. The degree of f is minimal. A necessary condition for obtaining a polynomial h that is epsilon equal to f over the convex hull of x and y, while it's arbitrarily not epsilon equal to f over the complement of that convex hull, is for h to have a larger degree than f. So f should be over-parameterized. So we have this polynomial that we have. Its degree is 7, minimal. It has perfectly separated the training set in the convex hull. How does it generalize? It generalizes. So before answering that, does it generalize well? The answer is we don't know. Maybe it generalizes depending on what we see outside the convex hull. It might generalize well or it might not. We don't know. Same as deep learning. Give us some testing set and then we will tell you if it generalizes well or not. That's how one would be able to. That's the game when we are extrapolating. But let's imagine that we know that there is this polynomial with this specific shape, with this specific extension, and that there's this unique decision boundary polynomial that would generalize perfectly well outside the convex hull. And let's say we have some prior knowledge, someone has given us some testing set or some unseen data that we have looked at it and says, okay, these are all red here, these are all blue here, so we have to have this line. And then what we can show is that we have to over-parameterize that polynomial, the previous polynomial, in order to get this polynomial. So that's a necessary condition. And then we can just generalize this in a more general case. Let's construct an H that is epsilon equal to f. That goes back to the lemma inside the convex hull, while it's arbitrarily not epsilon equal to f outside the convex hull. So that we in the 2D we can actually prove this, that this can be this is a necessary condition. But then let's think about how we should choose the epsilon, and the answer is relatively easy. The closest margin we have, once we have this f, the closest margin we have between all the points in the x and y from this polynomial, that gives us a bound on the epsilon. So once we compute that smallest margin, we can say that any other polynomial, any other function g, will also perfectly separate x and y as long as it is epsilon equal to f. So that's how we can come up with the value of the epsilon. So let me just get the main narrative, give the bigger picture. So we had this domain that we wanted to partition it. And so far I have partitioned it with a polynomial, but let's go one step further. Let's partition it with splines. And whatever S we have, we construct. We can construct it with one polynomial within the convex hull and other polynomials outside the convex hull. Then we can approximate that spline with some polynomial p, and p has some degree. The degree of the p gives us the notion of parameterization. So whatever spline you give me, I can approximate it with some p, some polynomial instead. And then we can approximate the p itself with a neural network. This is also in the literature. This is not a new finding. And a larger degree polynomial would require a neural network with more parameters. So if you approximate your spline with a larger degree polynomial, then you would have to have a larger neural network as well. And that gives me the notion of parameterization, transfers it from partitioning the domain all the way to the neural network that I need to utilize in order to make that partitioning. And because we care about the extensions of our function outside the hull, we need over-parameterization. So this is the main idea. So then let's just think about, instead of that polynomial we had, let's break it down and think of it as a spline. And so we have f within the convex hull, and we have g1 on this extension here, and g2 on this other side. And then based on the, let's keep the f or epsilon equal to f, but let's think about changing the g1 and g2 into things that are not epsilon equal to what we already have here. And based on what you choose, you would have different splines, and that would lead us to different polynomial approximations of different degrees, all of which would have degrees higher than 7. So if we come up with this G2 and G1, it would certainly require a polynomial of higher degree. And if we want to translate that into a neural network, it would lead to a neural network of larger size with more parameters. That would be the over-parameterization. So now that we established this over-parameterization necessity, let's think about that we are given these two sets of points, and we are given a polynomial of a higher degree polynomial, let's say 1,000 degree instead of 7. But we don't have the parameters for the polynomial. We just know we have this polynomial of 1,000 degree that we can utilize to separate this data. But how do we obtain the parameters of it so that we get this specific polynomial or any other specific ones? Just merely minimizing the training loss of this polynomial on this training data wouldn't necessarily lead to this polynomial. So that gives me to a conjecture here that would be very interesting to prove in the higher dimensional case. So let there be a convex hull defined within a hypercube domain. Let f be an arbitrary polynomial that partitions both the convex hull and the complement of the convex hull. If f is transformed to f plus by increasing the degree from n to a large enough n prime, for example, in that example, let's say the degree of the polynomial is increased from 7 to a few thousand. F is sufficiently over-parameterized to f plus, then there will be infinite number of distinct f plus that remain epsilon equal to f inside the convex hull, while not being epsilon equal to f outside the convex hull. So two functions are considered distinct when they're not epsilon equal. So that's what I mean by distinct. So when we have a polynomial of degree 7 and this data set, we can just minimize the training loss for this. And then we just, as long as we minimize it to 0, we get this polynomial. But that's not necessarily the case for this case. Once we have a polynomial of degree 1,000, let's say, just minimizing the training loss on this wouldn't lead to this. It could lead to many different polynomials. So we have to use a specific training regime in order to obtain this polynomial. And that's what we do in deep learning. In deep learning, we have to use a very specific training regime in order to obtain models that are generalizing well. So, and just as I mentioned earlier, minimizing the training loss to near 0, that's not good enough. And without knowledge of a testing or validation set, we don't know how to train over-parameterized models. So here are a few examples of just a standard two-layer neural network with ReLU activations, and the same data set I've been showing. So here is the under-parameterized regime. Here we don't have enough parameters to fit the training set. And the struggle is to just fit the data, separate the 2 point sets red and blue as best as we can. Of course, we won't be able because we are under-parameterized. But then here we have barely enough number of parameters to fit the training set. So all of these are fitting the training set, separating the training data perfectly well. But based on what training regime we use, the extensions of decision boundaries outside the convex hull. The whole partitioning outside the convex hull could be very different. And then once we over-parameterize the model very much, like very over-parameterize it highly, we still can perfectly separate the training data, but we have a lot of control over the partitioning outside the convex hull. So partitioning outside the convex hull could be very, very different, and we have a lot of control over that based on what training regime we use. What training regime we use, we can achieve very different partitioning. And based on the training regime, we can also see overfitting appear inside the convex hull, like these regions are all signs of overfitting. So I'm just going to conclude on this geometry side. We found no evidence that the functional task of a deep learning function can be explained merely by interpolation. So we need new theory for deep learning models in order to explain their generalization. Interpolation is not enough. Interpolation can't explain generalization of the network by itself. We saw testing images have visually have to change to reach the convex hull of the training set. The spatial relationship between training and testing images are not random though. So extrapolation has a limited, has a very specific definition, and it has a defined scope, and it has some moderate degree. We don't want to extrapolate too far outside the convex hull. A deep learning function has to moderately extrapolate, as I mentioned. And over-parameterization is a necessary condition to have control over the extensions, and over-parameterization and training regime work in tandem to shape the extensions of decision boundaries. I'm happy to take questions. I have other pieces that I can talk as well. A homotopy algorithm, I can quickly go maybe in 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, if you want to go another 5 or 10 minutes, that's absolutely fine. It's up to you.
Okay, sure. So I go ahead with the homotopy method for solving optimizations about deep learning model. So that N we discussed earlier on, that's the function we have been discussing all along. You can ask a lot of questions about that model. You can, that it's the same, basically the same function. It just has it has the same input, and the output is some classes. And the interpretation of these models is not so easy. There's a big literature again in deep learning on interpretation of deep learning models. And it's still an open research question. So this is a work I've done with my PhD advisor at University of Maryland, Diane O'Leary. And this is all I'm going to present is mostly this based on this paper and my thesis. So we can formulate whatever question you might have about this function. You can formulate it in terms of an optimization problem. You can, for example, say, what are the least changes in this input that can create this specific output for me, like sort of an inverse problem. But we are very interested in the decision boundaries of the model because of all that partitioning we discussed earlier. So for any given input, we would like to find the closest point to it on the decision boundary, because that point can provide a lot of insight to us about those decision boundaries. Of course, in a few thousand-dimensional space, I can't try to construct that whole decision boundary, but I can solve an optimization problem that was considered intractable in the literature and find the closest point to that. So we are interested specifically to formulate an optimization problem to find that. The objective function is minimization. We want to minimize the distance to the decision boundary. Our constraints have to do with the deep learning model. We want the output of the model to be, we want to find point on the decision boundary, and that by definition is a point that has equal scores for two output classes. In the multidimensional case, all other classes should have smaller values for all of, compared to those two classes that we want to flip. So these are the constraints we have here. And we have some bounds. Our domain is bounded. Of course, we don't want to get out of the bounds, but we can also have other constraints. For example, one might restrict certain colors in the image not to change, or one might want to restrict certain regions in the image not to change. So we can add all these constraints at the bottom of this list. And at the end, we have some a nonlinear objective, nonlinear optimization problem that we would have to solve. The problems with this optimization problem is that it's nonlinear in objective and constraints, highly nonlinear in the constraints that involve the neural network. It is non-convex, it is high dimensional, but most importantly, we encounter the issue of vanishing and exploding gradients for neural networks. So this is a known phenomenon for neural networks, and it can be explained by chain rule decomposition of the derivatives, gradients of the output of the network with respect to the input. So once we construct this, construct this chain rule decomposition, all these matrix multiplications, what happens is that smaller values tend to vanish, go to zero in absolute value, small values in the values. And then the larger in absolute value tend to grow and get larger and larger, and those tend to like explode. They don't actually overflow or underflow, but like we consider that vanishing and exploding, because at the end of the day, you get a Jacobian matrix that is badly scaled. It has many zeros and many large values, and the direction it gives you for solving the optimization problem is not so useful. So you take steps in that direction and you don't get anywhere you want to go. So the idea is that to transform the neural network using a homotopy transformation, such that we arrive at a neural network that has that we can compute its gradients easily, and its gradients are informative, and we gradually transform the model back to its original form, and we solve the optimization problem along the way until we solve the find the solution for the original problem, for the problem that was hard to solve. So this is the homotopy optimization process. So for the transformation of the neural network, we tune the activation functions layer by layer so that the gradients are bounded away from zero, and they're also upper bounded by 1 in absolute value. And then we change the bias parameter of the network in its last layer so that we have a feasible solution for the transform network. Starting with a feasible solution makes us likely to end with a feasible solution. And then we compute the Lipschitz constant of the original model and the transform model, and we choose the size of homotopy steps based on the Lipschitz constant. And we gradually transform the network back to its original form, solving the optimization problem along the way until we find the solution for the original one. So I'm going to present some formulations quickly, but for the activation functions in this formulation, I'm going to use Gaussian kernels. Because those are the nonlinear ones, and those are the more sophisticated ones to use. In practice, people usually use linear, like ReLU functions. Those are the same concepts applied to those as well. But what Gaussian kernels error function gives us is that we can get linear behavior and also nonlinear behavior from the function. So we derive the derivatives of the model, the derivatives of the output with respect to the input. And we do the recursion over the layers, and at the end we drive the Lipschitz bound on the output of the model. And then we show that during the homotopy transformation, that Lipschitz continuity is preserved, and it changes within this range. So at any step during this homotopy transformation, we have this notion of Lipschitz continuity, and we know what's the Lipschitz constant. So we can take our steps based on that knowledge. And then we show that as we are changing, taking the steps, if we take the steps small enough, the output of the network would change small enough as well. So we have control over how much the output of the network changes. And we start with a feasible solution. And because of this control we have, we can take the steps small enough, and then at the end, we are likely to end with a feasible solution at the end. of course, we can, based on the Lipschitz constant, we can take the steps adaptively. And this makes us likely to solve that optimization problem that was considered intractable in the literature. So once we have that insight, we can do, that provides a lot of insights about how the model works. Okay, I'm going to, instead of going through this list, quickly give you a case study, which is about classifying patients, predicting cancer based on the type of, based on microRNA measurement, genetic data taken from plasma in the blood. So patients come in, and you take their blood, you measure the genetic microRNA measurements, you measure the microRNAs in that plasma, and then you put it into a deep learning model, and the model will predict whether they have cancer, any sorts of these types of cancer, or maybe the model predicts they have no cancer. So this is a very efficient and low-cost approach to detecting cancer in large populations. So we do tensor decomposition, spectral methods, we do feature selection. We see that the accuracy of the model basically depends on 75 of those microRNA measurements. And then we solve that optimization problem to find closest points on those decision boundaries. We see that the mistakes of the model are all much closer to the decision boundaries compared to the correct classification. So that gives us a measure of confidence when a model predicts someone has cancer or not, but that's very close to its decision boundaries, we can be less confident in the correctness of the classification, and we can investigate that patient further because the model might be actually wrong. And then we investigate the directions to the decision boundaries, investigate the mistakes of the model to see which microRNAs have to change for us to reach the decision boundary. For example, if a patient has ovarian cancer, we can solve that optimization problem and see what microRNAs have to change in order for this person to be classified as non-cancer by the model. And finally, we modify the decision boundaries of the model. Once we find these points, we plant them into the training set, label them as like ovarian cancer again, plant them in the training set, retrain the model, and that pushes the decision boundaries away and enlarges the partitions for the cancer and shrinks the partitions for non-cancer. And that leads to a model that has a lower rate of false negatives. It rarely happens that the model says someone is fine, healthy, while they actually have cancer. But it makes more mistakes of patients who are healthy. Sometimes it might say these might have cancer. But of course, if they are fine, we can, a medical expert can investigate them. So I'm going to stop here. My time is out. I'm happy to answer any questions.